Hi everyone and welcome to this video. These are my 10 tips for programming REPRO-1. But most of this will work as general sound design advice that you can apply to just about any synth. So let's get started with our first tip, and that is the Oscillator Tweaks section. So REPRO-1 is not an overly complex synthesizer, the architecture is quite simple, but as is typical for UHE, they've included some extra stuff under the hood. In this case, we have different oscillator modes, which come from different circuitry that they were analyzing when they created REPRO-1. So before we go to the tweaks section, let's just take a look at what we actually have on the front panel. So we're listening to oscillator B here, and first of all we have a sawtooth, a triangle, and a square. Now we have a pulse width control of the square, so we can modify the duty cycle of the square waveform. Now this lets you get some different timbres out of the square waveform, but you can also modulate this. So in our case we're going to modulate this with the LFO. Now that's done on REPRO-1 by setting this switch over here to either direct or wheel, and I've gone with wheel, so I'm going to set the LFO to wheel as well. And what this will do is it will actually enable the modulation as I bring up the mod wheel. Now when you have just one oscillator to work with, pulse width modulation can give you the effect of two oscillators detuned against each other, so it can give you that fat detuned sound. Now let's go to the tweaks page, and there's some interesting things to take a look at. So we're going to take a look at the different oscillator models we can use here. First one is ideal, and we'll switch this to P1. Now you'll notice here that there's not really any audible difference, at least not an easy one to detect. So let's switch this now to P5, and then to bottom. Now bottom is the only one that really looks and sounds different. So you might wonder what the point of having these different models are if they sound the same. And while there is some sound variation to be had here, the difference is really in their behavior. Now these behavioral differences become more noticeable when you start mixing the oscillators or mixing their waveforms. So for example, let's go to ideal. Now due to the phase relationship between the sawtooth and the square, there's a lot of cancelling out going on, and so the result is a very thin waveform. The same is true for P1. But on P5, the square is inverted, so in this case you get a really fat, loud waveform. And it's a really nice mix of both the square and the sawtooth. So let's go back to ideal. We'll take off the square, and we'll bring in the saw on oscillator A. Now if you take a listen to these two waveforms playing together, you can hear them phasing against each other. Now our detune settings are the same, they're at 0. So you're hearing a natural drift between the oscillators here. It sounds quite a lot like a 3/0 flanger. Now as we increase the detune, this flanging effect becomes faster. So let's switch these both now to P1. And notice how much more these two oscillators drift. So the detune settings here are both set to 0. The oscillators just drift more. And you can also hear that the speed is not consistent either. So it's not just like, say, an LFO effect or a detune effect. Okay, so I'm just going to set this back to ideal. And next I want to bring your attention to the invert switch. So this switch allows you to flip the phase of oscillator B. Notice now we get something that's a whole lot like pulse width modulation. But this time it's with the saw waveforms. And by using the detune here, we can increase the speed of that modulation. Let's try that with the square waveforms. Now again, with the synth with a simple architecture like Repro, it's really useful to know exactly what kind of things you can do just on the oscillator level before you get to the filters and other things. Getting an interesting timbre out of the oscillators can make all the difference to your final sound. Okay, so let's take a look now at tip number 2. This is to do with sync and cross modulation. But first, a little bit of a primer on what sync and cross modulation does. So first, cross modulation. Now on REPRO-1 and in many other synthesizers, one of the oscillators can modulate the frequency of the other. In this case, the B oscillator can modulate the frequency of oscillator A. Now you can also do that with an LFO, but the difference with using an oscillator is it's many times faster or higher frequency than the typical LFO. And that's the case here in REPRO-1. Now it's important to note I've got oscillator B turned down here, so we just listened to oscillator A, and I'm now going to dial in oscillator B in the modulation path and switch in oscillator A's frequency. Now that's great for effects, but we can take this further and make it more useful for melodic sounds. Okay, so I'm going to dial back the oscillator modulation to nothing, and let's now take a look at oscillator sync. Now syncing creates what's called a master oscillator and a slave oscillator. My first tip is you want the master oscillator to be lower in pitch, but you want it to be normally tuned, because this oscillator is going to define the fundamental pitch of the slave oscillator. Now we can change the pitch control on oscillator A without actually changing its pitch. Instead, what happens is we change the timbre. Now one typical way this is used is an envelope is assigned to the pitch of the slave oscillator, and well, let's just take a listen to that sound. I'm sure you'll be familiar with it. But now if we bring back in the oscillator modulation, we get a very stable pitch, but we get enormous play over the timbre. Now I made use of this in different configurations in many of the presets in Prometheus.
Number 3.
Okay, so onto our next tip. This has to do with the EQ module in the effects section. You can use this to create very different waveform shapes. So let's take a look. So we'll first boost the mid frequency here. Now that's pushing up the volume a lot, so we can use the sonic conditioner just to bring that gain back down again. Now when things get interesting is when we start to tighten the resonance here. So now we have a very pronounced effect on the waveform, and you can see the change in the shape. So you can see all those ripples in the waveform there, and we can use the frequency control to change the position and the density of those ripples. So that gives us like a more resonant kind of waveform. But what we've also done here is created a sort of peak filter. So we can go into our keys section here, and this gives us access to the modulation tab. And what I'm going to do is choose the filter envelope as our modulation source. And then I'm going to right click here, go to our res queue, and go to the mid frequency. This is going to be our modulation destination. I'm going to increase the modulation amount here. I'm just going to load up a pattern in our sequencer here. Switch it to play, and switch on the clock. And now this mid control is controlling the cutoff point. So from here it's all about fine tweaking to get a nice result. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you here is what happens when we switch it into resonant mode. And we're boosting the midband so much that it's sounding more and more like a bandpass filter. A bandpass filter filters out the high end and the low end, but a really soft one leaves a lot of the low end and the high end still intact, but you just get the impression of a very large emphasis on the midband. So using this res mode, we can create a nice and soft bandpass filter. Now what I like to do in this case is we're going to go and reduce the filter envelope effect. And I'm going to assign this parameter to the mod wheel. Okay, now I'm going to show you something else you can do here too. I'm going to switch off this modulation for now. And now I'm going to bring up the other bands a little bit more here. And what we're creating here is resonant peaks at different points in the spectrum. And this gives you a very vocal-like quality. In fact, valve filters are built this way with 2 or 3 resonant peaks. Now if we move these 2 bands around, we'll get different valve sounds. Now to show you what this looks like, I'm going to dial in some noise. So this is what noise looks like on the spectrum here. And then when we bring in the res EQ, take a look how the shape changes when we dial up the resonance. Now we can play around with the spacing of these 3 bands as well, but we do only have 2 modulation destinations available in REPRO-1. So I'm going to choose to modulate the mid and the high band. We're going to do this with an LFO. Let's take a listen. Now another tip here is instead of modulating the high band in the same direction as the mid, we're going to invert it. Now if we combine that with our tip from earlier, the sync and the oscillator modulation, you can develop sounds that drift quite far away from typical analog synthesis. And the nice thing is as well, you don't have to ramp this up to full resonance. You could be more gentle and add a more subtle effect as well. Tip number 5. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is that if we pull the gain down on the midband instead of boosting it, we get a notch filter instead of a peak filter. Then when you modulate that midband, you get a gentle and relaxing sound effect, much like a phaser. Tip number 6. Okay, on to the next tip, a low pass filter from the EQ. So I've got an initialized patch here. I'm going to switch on the res Q. We'll go to resonant mode. I'm going to take away most of the low band here. And what we want to do is modulate the mid and high bands. So I'm going to go to our modulation slots here. We're going to bring in the filter envelope. Turn that up. Change the shape of the envelope. We'll assign it to the high band. I'm going to raise up the Q. This is all about fine-tuning and tweaking. So now let's also modulate the mid-frequency. This creates a low-pass filter with a very interesting formant quality to it. And you can see that's what I did here in the hydrogen preset from Prometheus. Notice I've also got the reverb there behind the res Q. This allows all the tails to go through res Q as well, giving res Q more work to do, which really accentuates that effect. So ordinarily, on a lot of synthesizers, reverb is perhaps one of the last stages in the chain. But here in Repro, we can rearrange the effects blocks. So if we want, we can actually set the reverb behind other effects, including the distortion. Now the distortion can create a very saturated and of course compressed sound. And when you set the reverb before the distortion, you get some really nice play between the synthesizer, the reverb, and the distortion layer. So here's what it sounds like with reverb after distortion, as you'd normally get. And now let's bring in the reverb before the distortion stage. Okay, so this next tip is creating a sidechain effect on the reverb. And by the way, I'm also using the same trick on the sonic conditioner, which is the final gain staging on the output. So I can actually modulate the volume of REPRO-1 without actually using a compressor or a sidechain plugin. So what I'm doing here is I'm modulating the overall gain and the reverb wet-dry mix here with velocity. I'm going to overemphasize that here. I'm going to turn down sonic conditioner, and then in the modulation tab, turn up the modulation. Now the way I'm doing this here is I've actually got the sequencer engaged and I've got the velocity setting to the lowest point where the kick would be, and I've let it rise up in between. You could also do this without using the sequencer, as Repro will respond to the MIDI velocity from your MIDI as well. Tip number 9. Okay, so this next tip is using drench to create pad sounds. Now Repro is of course monophonic, but if you set the decay to really long and the mix really high, you get very long tails, and it will create some nice sort of ambient style pads. Now they'll sound quite distant, but they have a nice character to them. Now if you turn on the arpeggiator, you can just actually hold down the chords you want to play, and you'll get a pad sound in that chord. And that's what I did with the creation preset in Prometheus.
Number 10.
Okay, so this next tip is about how you can improvise and rearrange your patterns. And that's without changing any of the pattern data. Now this one's really interesting on longer melodic sequences. So let's take a listen to the sequence as it was saved in this preset. So the first thing I want to point out here is if you press a note, and then you let go and you press a note again, the sequence is going to restart from the first step. However, if when you enter a new note you're still holding the old one, in other words you're playing legato, the sequencer will continue its progression through the steps, but it will also transpose to the new key. Let's take a listen to that. Now you can have fun with this on the fly, but you could also go in and create a MIDI sequence to create the correct transpositions at the right time, just like I've done here. Now notice some of these notes are overlapping. That means the sequencer will continue through these steps and it won't reset, and in other places I'm resetting the sequence. And these are just little tricks to keep things in the same key. So let's take a listen now. So those are my 10 tips for programming REPRO-1. I hope you enjoyed this video. I want to give a special thanks to all of you who bought the Prometheus Bank, and also to my Patreon supporters. Thank you all so much for your support, and take care.